So we kind of try to draw all that together on one graph just to help you see it a little bit, but it's kind of confusing, I think, to put it all together. And again, I really recommend you read the book on that little section we just did. But let's now divide this up into two more typical graphs. Let's think about a typical monopoly and a typical perfectly competitive firm. So here's perfect competition. Let's graph the market for perfectly competitive firms, and then let's think about a monopoly here. So here's the price, here's the quantity, here's the price, here's the quantity. These two graphs are going to have some characteristics that are similar and some characteristics that are very different. So let's start with the perfectly competitive market. This is regular supply and demand, that we've really been dealing with all semester. Here's your price, here's your quantity at equilibrium. And if you're an individual firm, well, then the price that happens in the market is what you're subject to. All right, don't have to draw the individual firm again. We did that in the past. Now let's compare that to the monopoly. The demand curve is the same. So if you're comparing two products, let's say that this is beer for the entire market, and this is beer in the case of a monopoly. Even though this is video, I'm still going to talk about beer. All right, so let's say this is beer for an entire market, and this is beer like if you're in a monopoly situation, like being at a concert or a football game or something, okay? So you can basically imagine supply and demand, there's going to be some similarities, some differences. Turns out the similarity comes from demand. Demand is going to be pretty similar in either case, right? The demand for beer is existent all of the time, regardless of whether or not you're at a football stadium or not, okay? It may change a little bit depending on if you're at the football stadium or not, but it's still just based on consumers' desires, okay? So we've got demand, we've got demand. The big difference, though, for the monopoly is they face that marginal revenue curve that's twice as steep. Perfectly competitive firms don't face that because they're not price searchers, they are price takers. So this firm can choose which price they can charge, and then marginal revenues will be different depending on which price they choose in quantity. Then we've got our marginal cost curve, all right? The reason why perfectly competitive firms and monopolies are different is in regards to supply. Supply here is the entire market. This is all of those producers. But for the individual firm, it's just the one producer. So it's only their costs that matter. So we can just graph their marginal costs because there's no other costs to consider. All right? From that, this would be their quantity. And this would be their price. And so we need to think about the welfare effects here, comparing the two. Calling back to something we've done a while back, let's think about the consumer and producer surplus in these two scenarios. All right? For the perfectly competitive market, the consumer surplus would be here. That's our consumer surplus. All right? If you can sort of visualize it, that would be this triangle on the monopoly graph. All right? But the monopoly is charging a higher price, which is going to reduce the consumer surplus. So our consumer surplus is going to be a much smaller triangle in this case. All right? Now let's think about the producer surplus. Producer surplus, or the perfectly competitive firm, or excuse me, for the perfectly competitive market, would be this triangle here. All right? And where's the deadweight loss? There is none. There is no deadweight loss for the perfectly competitive market because they're taking advantage of all of the potential. All of the surplus from the market that's possible is being extracted. For these goods being produced, you've got all the goods where the demand is higher than supply and no extra goods. Perfect scenario. For the monopoly, you'll see that the producer surplus is going to be this area here. Turns out it's kind of a weird shape that you're not going to have to solve for graphically. But it ends up being this shape in here. This is our producer surplus. And that is bigger than the amount that the perfectly competitive firm gets. All right, so the perfectly competitive market will get a producer surplus, but there's a bigger one when we're thinking about a monopoly. And that leaves us with this area in here which is our deadweight loss. No good. It's never good to have deadweight loss because that means that there is potential surplus that the market is not getting. All right, that deadweight loss is potential surplus that the market is not getting. So here's the deal. Monopolies reduce consumer surplus. All right, you can see that here. This triangle is bigger than this one. It's kind of trying to draw on the scale there. Consumer surplus here is bigger because they're buying more and being charged less. Two good things if you're a consumer. So monopolies, in effect, reduce consumer surplus. They charge more, they sell less. They increase producer surplus. Producer surplus is going to be bigger because the firm is going to be able to charge a higher price. All right, and if you're wondering, well, is this area always going to be bigger than this area? Well, in fact, it will be because they're going to be profit maximizing, okay? And if they're profit maximizing, they're going to choose the shape here that is effectively the biggest, all right? And that's easy for them to do. All they have to do is maximize profits, and in turn, they'll maximize producer surplus too. All right, so monopolies reduce consumer surplus, they increase producer surplus, and as a result, they create deadweight loss, which is never a good thing. This market is inefficient. And the key thing to recognize here that monopolies are inefficient in the sense that they do not maximize the resources, the value of the resources. There's possible resources here that could be making society better, and they're not, okay? So if you ever thought to yourself, I'd like to go to the cafeteria at Georgia College, and I'd be willing to pay $6 for it, but the price is actually $7, this may sort of explain what's going on with you. They could make a profit if they could just sell to you at your willingness to pay. But the problem is they have no mechanism to do that. If they drop the price for you, they're going to have to drop it for everybody. So they don't drop it, right? They keep price at a high level. They charge more than they would otherwise. Okay? So monopolies are inefficient. And for this reason, monopolies can be illegal. In some scenarios, monopolies are deemed to be illegal. This is often referred to as Antitrust Regulations. So if you've ever heard this term antitrust, this is usually what's being referred to, is thinking about breaking up monopolies. So let me give you a couple of examples of monopolies. Sirius XM Radio. All right, they've been around for a long time now, but at one point in time there was XM Radio and there was Sirius Radio. Two different radio stations, right? Two different satellite radio stations. They decided to merge, and there was a court case basically arguing, should they be allowed to merge or not? Some people believe that they were trying to become a monopoly, which would lead them to charge a higher price, okay? But the counter argument was, well, they're a natural monopoly. It makes sense that there would only be one satellite radio system, okay? Ultimately, they were allowed to do so, so they merged, they became a monopoly. They're the only primary satellite radio producer. Okay. A secondary example, all right, kind of similar type of market. The market for daily fantasy sports, you may know about this, maybe you don't. There's DraftKings and there's FanDuel. They make up about 95% of the market. About a year ago, they decided they wanted to merge, but the government made it very clear that if they merged, they would face a lot of lawsuits, and basically they were going to get broken up. Ultimately, they decided not to merge. The argument there is there's not really a natural monopoly when it comes to fantasy sports. So they were broken up. The government did not want them to merge because they were afraid they would end up charging higher prices for their products, reducing quantity, and creating a deadweight loss. So in a lot of cases, monopolies are deemed to be illegal, which is really quite interesting because monopolies are often created by the government, right? In the case of, say, Sodexo, right? In the case of, say, the U.S. Postal Service, which has a monopoly of sorts. But then also they're broken up by the government. So the government creates lots of monopolies, and they also destroy a lot of monopolies. So I guess that's a good place to leave off on. These videos are going to be way more condensed than we would have in class because I'm not answering any questions. I'm hoping that if something's confusing, you can rewind back and listen to it again. You can also ask questions directly in the YouTube video. And in the future, I may try to give a little hint or two, maybe some bonus questions that are posted. So if you're watching the whole video, you will do better on your grades, even if it doesn't come from learning the material. I'm going to give you little incentives to make sure you're watching the videos because I need you to watch them, all right? I need you to watch them and I need you to take notes because otherwise you're going to do poorly on the quizzes and exams This class is still going to be hard, even though it's online. So I'll stop right there.